Welcome to the Liberty Insider. This is your religious liberty program, bringing up-to-date news, views and analysis of religious liberty events in the US and around the world. My name is Lincoln Steed, editor of Liberty magazine, and my guest on this program is author Elijah Mvundura.
Yes.
Welcome back to this program. This is not your first time. I know you've read Liberty magazine for many, many years, even when you were a young man.
Yes.
Not too long ago, on the back cover of Liberty, we had one of our nice poster presentations with a power quote. And I had the artist draw a picture of John Locke up in the sky like the sun king, if you like, with the rays of sun shining down on the American Republic. What do you think of that? Is that I mean, figuratively, that was a picture, but is that figuratively wrong?
It does capture the origins of America. I mean, anybody who reads American history, even in high school, they were based on the ideas of John Locke.
But very few people remember that nowadays,
yes,
do
it's
they?
very important for people to know that when they were drafting the constitutions, when they were debating the Federalist Papers and the like, their ideas were informed by John Locke.
Now, who was he?
John Locke was an English philosopher who lived in the 17th century. And he was actually a friend of John Newton, Isaac Newton, I'm sorry. Yes.
No, it was John Newton.
Isaac
Newton was the him.
Yeah, Isaac Newton was the him. I mean, the scientist who discovered that, he
described gravity.
They described gravity. They were actually friends. And why it is important to understand people like John Locke and the like is that those people, when they were designing their theories, for example, the principle of religious liberty is taken from Locke's book, Toleration. But those ideas, when you actually read the book itself, he bases the principle of toleration on the Bible. He actually used the Bible to build the principle of religious toleration or religious liberty, and people are not aware of that. Today we speak about liberty, but we cannot understand liberty unless we understand that it is taken from John Locke, and from John Locke, he based it on scriptural foundation, that you cannot coerce someone. Christ did not force anyone. He did not use the sword. So it's important for us to go to those, because liberalism today, or liberty, has been reduced to license.
Yeah, you're
but
right.
That was not his initial...
To underscore what you're saying, both Locke and Newton were deeply spiritual, and both of them, as I remember, indulged themselves in prophetic analysis at different times. And Newton, when he developed the law of gravity, was really trying to explain God's ways. He believed that it was God's power exercised momentarily. He was a bit disappointed to find what appeared to be a perpetuating law.
Yes, actually people need to know that Newton spent more time studying the books of Daniel and Revelation than actually working on his scientific studies. And there is a link. You cannot actually separate his theology from his science, because just as God had dominion over nature, he had also dominion over human history. So these were interlinked in Newton's studies.
Yeah.
And another thing that is very important when you look at Newton, because of the Aristotelian complex that we're talking about, the Greeks had everything that they needed to have modern science, but they could not conceive the idea of change, qualitative change. Yeah. Because tradition weighed so heavily in the Middle Ages. The only way that the early moderns could conceive change, that you can actually change and build a better future, it was through their reading of Daniel and Revelation. Francis Bacon, who is actually called the father of the modern scientific method, the jacket cover on his jacket cover is Daniel 12. Knowledge shall what? Shall increase. Man shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase.
No, I agree with your point. Let me throw something in that you probably thought about, but very few people do. You've got Newton, Locke, and
Francis Bacon, and Robert Ball. Robert Ball, the father of modern chemistry.
The English philosophers, basically, very deeply grounded, personally in theology, but their whole worldview was derivative from Christianity, there's no question. What about the French philosophers? they were not just secular, they were antagonistic to religion. I think that's another branch, and people imagine that to this day that the US is based on the principles that ended up with the French Revolution, and I say no, and I think you would agree. It's this English line which is far more religious and basic to our Judeo-Christian traditions.
Yes,
where the French Revolution is a blind alley. If it's connected to anything, it's Marxism and some of these other things.
Yes, that point is very important if you want to understand our current crisis. In fact, people, they use this word, enlightenment, and they use it as one term. But there was not one enlightenment, there were several. Absolutely. There was the moderate enlightenment of Newton and Locke. And they are actually the guys who inspired the French philosophers. And why did as you rightly say, the French Enlightenment was radical, anti-religious, and anti-Christian. Voltaire, they were anti-Christian.
Right.
But why were they anti-Christian?
Deeply cynical.
Yes, but why were they that? People never ask themselves. It was because of the dominance of the Catholic Church in France.
Which was the undercurrent of the French Revolution. It was an overreaction to the abuses of the church there.
Yes, because in England, because of the Glorious Revolution, I think you're aware of it, the Glorious Revolution in 1688.
Absolutely.
With that, they enshrined the rule of law, the supremacy of Parliament in accordance with the king. And because of that, you have all this religious liberty. And anyway, if I can go back a little bit, because of the English Civil War.
On to my hobby horse.
Yes, it's very, very important for people to know that because there were many Protestant sects in England, that's why they ended up having religious liberty anyway. That was the context that made Locke to be able to separate religion and politics, because there were just many churches. Yeah. But in the French side, it was hard for them to conceive religious liberty because there was only one church, which was the Catholic Church. And so for them, when they were attacking...
Which had not, in the far distant future, acted murderously against Protestant opposition.
Yes.
And expelled them.
Yes, so these are two different things. And I think there is one French thinker, famous, I always have a problem pronouncing his name, Alexis Tocqueville.
Alexis de Tocqueville, that's how I say it.
Tocqueville, yes. He actually cited the reason why people are anti-religious in France. It's not because they hate Christianity, but because they are attacking the church's involvement in politics. This is what made the French Enlightenment radical, and this is why the French Revolution was also radical. They were not only attempting to change the political institutions, they were also trying to change the religious institution.
Yeah.
But it was at a very theoretical level. And so in America, even more than Britain was not really able to completely separate religion and politics because the Anglican Church was the established church. But in America... Yes, it's still the established church. Yeah. But in America, it was different, as we know. Many, many different sects, Protestant sects, the Presbyterians, the Quakers, the Methodists, they came to America. And because of that reality, this is why ultimately they de-established the church. And now...
Everybody feared everybody else.
Feared everybody else, yes.
You know, the idea of American history is that there was this pure idea from the beginning to keep religion out. I don't think so. Even some of the main figures in the Revolutionary Party, and I'm trying to think of the guy, give me liberty or give me death, Patrick Henry.
Patrick Henry,
I mean,
yes.
He wanted church and state joined together like this, but it couldn't stand because there were so many factions who each feared that if the other got some political power that they would persecute them.
But James Madison, the father of the American Constitution, must also remember that he actually observed the radicalism that religion was bringing in. And actually when you actually read most of his writings, you can actually see that's what influenced him ultimately to say that if we're going to have peace and maintain the purity of the gospel, we need to separate these things.
And a big part of his developing personal position was he had seen Baptist preachers imprisoned for illegal preaching. He knew in pre-revolutionary America how bad a thing religious intolerance was.
Yes, and I think it's important to emphasize that because unlike the French, it was all at a philosophical level without actually a practical application. In the case of the American founding fathers, they were actually reacting to concrete historical events. Right. And hence they were not dreamers, as it were. They're not trying to build utopias. They actually analyze human nature, and I think it's very, very important. Many people today, they speak of the separation of powers. But what actually informed the separation of powers was their fear of ambition and passions. They actually knew that human beings are sinful by nature, and they were informed by the theological anthropology of Martin Luther and Calvin. Yeah. Within the Protestant tradition, the idea is human beings are sinful. Where did they get that? They get that from the story of the fall. And it is from that base.
Particularly, they got it from Calvin.
Yes, they got it from Calvin. So basically, when they're...
You and I have been talking about that. The thread that most informs American political and religious development is Calvinism, not Lutheranism.
Yes, it's not... Yes, it is from John Calvin, yes. But the whole idea that a human being is sinful is very important, actually, to the founding of the American Constitution. So this whole separation is to prevent this convergence of interests of creating an all-powerful state that actually snuffs out human liberty. So it's important for us to know that, because what has happened, I think, in America is that while the American founding fathers were influenced by the moderate enlightenment of Newton and Locke, that was grounded in religious, in Calvinist motifs and beliefs, the American intelligentsia, academics, since the Second World War, have actually been influenced by the French thinkers, and Heidegger and the German thinkers. And so the anti-religious, the anti-religiosity, the anti-Christian stance of the American academics does not represent the American, the founding of America.
There's been a shift.
There has been a shift.
Part of the shift been, and in private discussion, you were quoting German theologians. Hasn't that been an additional shift to turn religious thought, where early American religious thought wasn't overly influenced by German theological development?
It was not,
Not from the point of Luther until, I think, post-World War II.
Yes. Maybe to do that, maybe we need to remind ourselves of the Great Awakening.
Yes.
In the 19th century, because in the 19th century, America had a great awakening. Not only in America, Britain too. Wesley's revival.
Of course.
At the time when they were experiencing this religious revival, that was the very same time in Germany where you had all those things about Hegel and Marx, all these theologies. So you can almost put them side by side. While, and of course, maybe let me go back and give a context a little bit. The context is the French Revolution. The French Revolution, people expected it to bring liberty, but it ended up in terror.
Well, you know, famously, and I like music as well as history, you know, Beethoven was writing a symphony to honor Napoleon, who was the hero of this whole thing.
Yes.
And he saw, as eventually the whole world did, eventually by the Battle of Waterloo, he saw that this was subverting these somewhat idealistic aspirations of the French Revolution. And so he changed it to the heroic symphony and screwed up his dedication to Napoleon.
Yes, but it's important for us to go back there, because at the very time when America was having a religious revival, you are having a revival of secular religions on this other side. And those secular religions are the ones that have started to influence, that started influencing America since the 1960s. The radical liberalism, the radical individualism that we're experiencing
today. There's a direct
today.
track on that.
Yes.
We'll take a break now. Stay with us and get your thinking caps on. Heavy philosophizing and history recounting and theology, but we need to be aware of this as we unravel today's very complicated church-state issues. Welcome back to the Liberty Insider. Before the break, we were deep in the weeds of describing and discussing the English and the French Enlightenment leaders and trying to help our readers see in this an explanation as to why England and then the United States went a different direction from France and other parts of Europe.
Yeah, it's very,
at the time of revolution.
Yes, it's very important to understand that 19th century background if we want to understand where we are today. Yeah. Because as I said in the previous segment, while America and Britain were experiencing a religious awakening, in Europe, they were having all these philosophies, secular religions, actually, if we want to be precise. It is those secular religions or philosophies that came to America after the Second World War and dominated the American universities.
Now, why did they come to America after the war?
After the war, good question. America has always, again, it had that great Christian influence. American philosophy was not big in building systems, you know, big philosophies. And there was also a large Christian influence. So they were really attracted to this very powerful and deep, you know, anybody who's read the Germans, they're very, very deep. And so that was really fascinating. Heidegger and Friedrich Nietzsche, he speaks about those things. And basically Nietzsche, and I think, good question, I think I get my point. Nietzsche basically is the guy who said God is dead.
Yeah.
So you cannot have the rule of the experts. You cannot have the intellectuals dominant if God is there. So in a way, they are attracted to that, and that's my personal view. They are attracted to the theories of Heidegger and Nietzsche because Nietzsche basically says God is dead. We human beings, we have got to be God.
Yeah, we're the Superman.
Yes, so during this, after the Second World War, we have all this social engineering. And who is engineering society? Is the academics, the intellectuals. Basically, they've taken the place of who? The place of God. And so to me, those theories are very attractive. And that's why even French philosophers, that's why they supported these totalitarian regimes. Many, they support Marxism. Why do they like Marxism? Because Marxism, it's a religion of the intellectuals.
Well, I'll tell you why I asked the question, and maybe you'll answer it.
I don't know whether I answered it.
Because it's a sad reality that after America as a liberal democracy entered the war in Europe late, there's a whole story why late. You know, people like to say the greatest generation that defeated Hitler. Well, they did, but it's sort of crazy that America stayed out of it and actually was very sympathetic to Germany through much of the war, and we only entered when Japan forced our hand. But when the war was over, when the Nazi excesses came to light, they were not really known before then. Amazingly, the US government, at least parts of it, brought many of even the medical experts who'd been experimenting on inmates, brought them across.
Yes.
They brought the scientists across, and Werner von Braun, demonstrably a war criminal, this became one of the great heroes of American space endeavors. So there was a lot going on where we sort of absorbed, we thought the best, but with it perhaps the worst of what was going on in Germany. So why at that same time did we take their philosophical thought?
Yes, you know, the German universities, we've got to recognize one thing. They were the leading universities in the world. You know, they led in the sciences and the like. They were the cutting edge in the sciences and in the philosophy also. And so, and many of them, of course, they ran away from Hitler. We had a lot of this that came over here.
Yeah,
but so they came also with their problems. Of course, you cannot separate your thought, your philosophy from your background. And it was influenced by the problems that were first in Germany, which were different from the problems in America.
Yeah.
In America, religion and politics were not really at war. That's why people did not have a problem, for example, with prayer in schools before the 60s, because it has always been like that. But there was the culture war, you know, with Bismarck. And the same wars, theological, political conflicts in France. Basically, they imported those problems into America.
Yeah, no, you answered it. It was clearly the exodus of the academics at the same time that came here.
And actually, you can see actually the decomposition of American culture begins actually in the 70s. That's where we actually had mid-60s. I would say
66.
Yes, for me, 66. I know that you like 66. 66. For me, I think that the late 60s was so much the sowing time in the universities. But really, the whole thing about identity, feminism, and all that, it actually permeates the broader culture in the 70s. And today, we're actually, if it was sowing time, I would say that America right now is harvesting that radical liberalism, the radical individualism. And we should know that the idea of an individual, the individual liberty, we get that from the Bible. all the other religions, I once mentioned to somebody, and people are not aware that when we speak of the individual as separate from the group, in my African tradition, it's not the individual who is important.
Yeah.
It is the group.
That's right.
And all societies have always believed, have always operated in this group identity, and we're having the same thing, tribalism. The idea of the individual, it first comes with early Christianity, in the gospel.
Yes, Christianity. It's not as obvious in the Old Testament, I think.
Yes, but it's in the New Testament.
The dignity of the individual is there.
Yes.
But still, that was the story of the Jewish people and of the
because Christ,
of the believers as a group.
Yes, Christ comes and says that I did not come to bring peace, to separate the man from his wife, children, and so it is from that idea. They were told to leave everything. When they called the disciples, they were called to leave everything, their family, and to stand as individuals. You are talking about it comes with Christianity. I would say even it starts in the Old Testament, because the prophets were lonely men. They were individuals against the group. Yeah. So the idea of an individual is not just standing alone. This is most important, whether in the Old Testament or in the New Testament. The individual is not standing alone. As Kierkegaard says, is an individual before God. Mm-hmm. So it was not radical liberalism where you just do what you want. No, liberalism, the radical individualism. It's not just an individual without any laws. And so what has happened with this radical thought that we have in the American universities that assess the individual who is a godlike figure, that comes from Nietzsche. Within the Newton, Lockean tradition, it's an individual under God. And so what we're having today, we've got to ask ourselves, how do we solve these problems of radical individualism? And to me, I don't think they can be solved by legislation. I think
let me throw something wild in. The time is running out. I know you're very partial to Dostoevsky.
Yes.
I'm trying to think of which of his works. There's one where there's a guy that became fixated on understanding God or understanding freedom. And he believed that the ultimate act was to commit suicide, thereby he would become God because he was such an opposition to God.
Yes, that was in The Demons, his book In the Demons. So that basically he actually shows some of his characters. For example, Shatov, he believed in God, but the other one did not believe in God, and he believed that if he kills himself, in order to serve
in
the
that
universe,
act, he becomes God.
He becomes God, but he's actually an imitation of Christ, because you remember Christ dies to save mankind, and he believes that if he commits suicide in terms of the Christian ideology, he'll be able to serve humankind. Yeah. But I think I want to return.
But we're in a sort of a cultural suicide right now, I think.
Yes.
So sometimes elements of our society are so determined to shake loose from an acknowledgement of God that it's almost on a suicidal path, thinking that this cuts us loose, but it's a dead-end road. That's my point.
Yes, I think that, but we should recognize, I think you're very, very right, but I think one of the things that we need to recognize is that the problems that we're facing today, they are not new. No. The 19th century...
Nothing new under the sun.
Yes, they faced the same problem, the same crisis of modernity, the same crisis of liberalism. How do you reconcile individual liberty with society? Those problems were there in the 19th century. There were different solutions. Nietzsche represented a whole different solution to those problems. And to me, the solutions that have been given by Nietzsche are the ones that have been adopted by the American universities, the American intellectuals. And I think what is needed today is to ask ourselves as Christians, is it the right response to our civilizational crisis? And I don't think that the solution, according to many Christians, is through legislation. The problem runs much deeper than that. I believe what is needed is a religious revival. Just as there was a religious revival in the 19th century, we need a genuine religious revival. That's the only one, I believe, that can solve the fraying of the social fabric, the fraying of our societies. The only solution, I believe, is a genuine religious revival. Without it, we're doomed.
The casual visitor to Washington, D.C., after doing the rounds of a few of the monuments and noticing the Masonic influence in design and layout, might be tempted to think that it was most influenced by Masonry. And of course, that's an undeniable thing. But as we illustrated on the back of Liberty once with a picture of John Locke shining like the sun down on the American experiment, the ideas of Locke and other Christian-influenced English philosophers had much, if not most, to do with the logic and founding and framework of the American Republic. I think it is a providential development of history. The truth of Christian faith and the sensibilities that go with that had so informed a new republic. And even today, with all of the secularism, the globalism, the constraints that we have, Christianity shines through. For Liberty Insider, this is Lincoln Steed.